Sub-zero wind clawed through the canyon, dropping temperatures to a lethal 45 below zero. Down in the valley, power lines snapped, plunging hundreds into dark, freezing homes. Yet high on the ridge, one woman sat comfortably in a t-shirt, her controversial hand-built cabin, holding a steady 70 degrees. Abigail Foster was not a doomsday prepper, nor was she a radical survivalist. She was, until 3 years ago, a senior structural engineer in Chicago, calculating load-bearing tolerances for high-rise steel. But after a drunk driver took the lives of her husband and young daughter on a snowy Interstate 90, the steel and glass canyons of the city became suffocating. Abigail sought silence. She found it on 15 acres of punishing rocky terrain in the remote stretches of Idaho's Bitterroot Mountains. When Abigail first arrived in the small town of Pine Ridge, she became an instant oddity. She didn't hire the local contractors to build a picturesque, sprawling log cabin. Instead, she brought in an excavator and began digging a massive trench directly into the side of a south-facing hill. "You're building a grave, Ms. Foster," Greg Harmon had told her one afternoon at the local hardware store. Greg was a wealthy developer from California who had recently constructed a 3-story luxury off-grid lodge a mile down the mountain from Abigail's property. His home was a marvel of modern consumer survivalism, a massive array of automated solar panels, 3 industrial-sized propane generators, and smart home technology that could monitor the temperature of his wine cellar from his smartphone. Abigail had just smiled politely, paying Brenda the cashier for 50 tubes of heavy-duty silicone sealant. "It's an earth-sheltered, passive solar design, Greg. The ground temperature stays around 50 degrees year-round. I'm just tapping into it." Greg had scoffed, zipping up his expensive down jacket. "Dirt gets cold, Abigail. When winter hits, you'll be freezing in that mud hut. If you need a warm place to stay, my backup, generators can power a small city." For 2 years, Abigail ignored the whispers and the skeptical glances. She meticulously constructed her cabin, which she quietly dubbed the Burrow. She poured a heavily insulated concrete foundation, but the real magic was in the walls. The northeast and west walls were bermed, buried under 4 feet of earth. The entire south-facing side was a slanted wall of double-paned, argon-filled glass. Inside, directly behind the glass, she stacked 60 50-gallon steel drums, painted matte black, and filled them with water. It was a massive trombe wall, a thermal battery designed to soak up the intense, high-altitude winter sun during the day and slowly radiate that heat into the living space at night. But theories and structural engineering models were about to be violently tested by reality. In late January, meteorologists began tracking an anomaly. A massive lobe of the polar vortex had detached and was sinking rapidly southward. It wasn't just a storm, it was an atmospheric collapse. The National Weather Service issued a chilling, unprecedented warning for the region. "Expect historic, life-threatening temperature plummets. Grid failures are imminent. Do not travel. Do not rely on standard emergency services." The morning before the storm hit the air in Pine Ridge felt dangerously heavy. The temperature was a deceptive 32 degrees Fahrenheit. Down in the valley, residents rushed to stock up on firewood, gasoline, and groceries. Up on the ridge, Abigail was performing a different kind of preparation. She wasn't panicked. She was methodical. She checked the seals on her triple-locked insulated doors. She inspected the subterranean air tubes, 300 feet of PVC pipe buried deep underground that pulled fresh air from the outside, utilizing the Earth's natural warmth to preheat the air before it entered her cabin. By 4 p.m., the sky turned a bruised, sickening shade of purple. The wind didn't just blow, it roared like a descending freight train. Then the bottom fell out of the thermometer. Within 2 hours, the temperature plummeted from freezing to -20 degrees. By 8 p.m., it hit -35, with wind chills pushing past -60. The sheer speed of the drop was catastrophic. Down the mountain, Greg Harmon sat in his leather recliner, a glass of bourbon in hand, watching the snow lash against his immense bay windows. His smart thermostat read a cozy 72 degrees. He felt a surge of arrogant satisfaction. His massive propane furnace was humming perfectly. He had spent over $100,000 on his energy system. He was untouchable. He didn't realize that standard propane stops vaporizing, stops turning from a liquid into a gas at -44 degrees Fahrenheit, and the temperature in the Bitterroots was still dropping. At 11:15 p.m., the valley's primary power grid failed. A massive transmission tower, burdened by ice and battered by 80-mile-per-hour gusts, simply twisted and collapsed. Across Pine Ridge houses went pitch black. Inside the burrow, Abigail didn't even notice the grid collapse. She was entirely disconnected from it. She sat in her armchair, reading a paperback by the warm glow of a small LED lamp powered by a modest battery bank. She was wearing a light cotton t-shirt and yoga pants. She glanced at her digital indoor/outdoor thermometer. Outside, -46 degrees Fahrenheit. Inside, 68 degrees Fahrenheit. The thermal mass of her black water barrels was performing flawlessly. All day, despite the cold outside, the bright, unclouded winter sun had blasted through her south-facing windows, heating the water in the steel drums. Now, in the pitch black of a deadly freeze, those drums were acting like a massive silent radiator, gently pushing heat into the small earth-insulated space. The 4 feet of soil wrapped around her cabin acted as a perfect thermal blanket, completely blocking the howling wind that was stripping the heat from every traditional home in the county. Outside, the forest was screaming. The cold was so profound, so sudden, that the sap inside the surrounding lodgepole pines was freezing and expanding. Every few minutes, Abigail heard a sound like a rifle shot, crack, as a tree literally exploded from the internal pressure. It was a terrifying, violent symphony of nature turning hostile. Down the mountain, Greg Harmon's luxury fortress was dying. At midnight, Greg's primary furnace sputtered and died. The thermostat clicked off. Annoyed, Greg set his bourbon down and walked to the utility closet to check the digital interface. Error 404, fuel delivery failure. Damn it, he muttered, grabbing his heavy coat and a flashlight. He stepped out onto his back deck, the wind immediately punching the breath from his lungs. The cold was a physical wall. It burned his exposed skin instantly. He waded through thigh-high drifts to his massive 1,000-gallon propane tank. He shined the light on the regulator. It was encased in a thick block of white frost. The liquid propane inside the tank had become so incredibly cold that it could no longer boil into the gas needed to feed his generators and furnace. His $100,000 system was utterly paralyzed by basic chemistry. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced Greg's chest. He rushed back inside his hands, already growing numb. The temperature in his massive high-ceilinged lodge was dropping rapidly. Without the continuous blast of the furnace, the massive glass windows that gave him such beautiful views were now acting as giant ice blocks, sucking the heat from the room. Within 2 hours, the inside of Greg's house plummeted to 30 degrees. His breath plumed in the air of his own living room. He tried to start his backup gasoline generator in the garage, but the oil had thickened into a sludgy gel, and the engine refused to turn over. He grabbed his cell phone to call the county sheriff, only to find the screen completely dead. The nearby cell towers had lost their backup battery power an hour ago. Greg was trapped in a freezing mansion, surrounded by dead technology. Up in the burrow, Abigail was brewing a cup of chamomile tea on her small indoor rocket mass heater, a highly efficient wood stove she had built from clay and brick, though she barely needed it tonight. The cabin was holding a steady 65 degrees now, a full 111 degrees warmer than the deadly air, just inches beyond her glass wall. She turned on her emergency ham radio, scanning the local emergency frequencies. The airwaves were a chaotic mess of static and desperate voices. "Dispatch, this is Unit 4. We can't get the plows up Highway 9. The drifts are 6 feet, and the diesel is gelling in the lines. We are stuck. County, we have multiple reports of burst pipes and hypothermia in the lower valley. We need evac over. Negative all units. Shelter in place. I repeat, no rescue vehicles are moving tonight. Do not go outside." Abigail listened, her heart aching. She knew the reality of this cold. It didn't just make you shiver. It put you to sleep. It shut down your organs. She looked around her cozy, warm, silent sanctuary, a profound sense of survivor's guilt washing over her. She was safe, perfectly insulated in her earth womb, while just miles away, people were fighting for their lives. Suddenly, a sound cut through the low hum of the radio and the roaring wind outside. It was a dull, rhythmic thud. Abigail froze her teacup halfway to her lips. She strained her ears. There it was again. Thump, thump, thump. It was coming from the reinforced, insulated airlock door at the entrance of her tunnel. Her blood ran cold. No animal knocks, and no human could possibly be wandering around in negative 46-degree weather with 80-mile-per-hour winds. It was a death sentence in minutes. She set her tea down her hands, trembling slightly. She walked to the heavy wooden coat rack, reaching behind it to grab the cold steel grip of a pump-action 12-gauge shotgun. Living alone in the remote wilderness had taught her to be cautious. She crept through the short, concrete-lined entryway toward the heavy steel door. Thump, thump. The knocking was weaker now, sluggish. Abigail pressed her ear against the freezing metal of the door. Through the howling wind, she heard a sound that made her drop the shotgun to the floor. It was a voice, barely a rasp, breaking into a pathetic, wet sob. "Please. Oh God, please, I'm dying." Abigail threw the 3 deadbolts and yanked the heavy door open. Snow and brutal biting wind instantly blasted into the entryway. A figure collapsed inward, falling face first onto the concrete floor in a pile of snow and expensive shredded designer winter gear. The man was entirely covered in white frost, his face a terrifying shade of blue-gray, his lips cracked and bleeding. Abigail stared in absolute shock. It was Greg Harmon. The man who had mocked her dirt hut was now lying on its floor, slowly freezing to death. Abigail grabbed Greg by the collar of his ruined, ice-caked parka and hauled him over the threshold. It took every ounce of her strength. He was dead weight, his limbs stiffening like frozen timber. She slammed the heavy steel door shut instantly, cutting off the deafening roar of the blizzard. The sudden silence in the airlock was ringing, punctuated only by Greg's shallow, rattling breaths. She dragged him into the main living space. The ambient temperature was 65 degrees, a stark, impossible contrast to the lethality outside. Greg, look at me." Abigail commanded her voice, slicing through his delirium. His eyes rolled back. His skin was pale and waxy, the classic, terrifying signs of severe frostbite and advanced hypothermia. Greg Harmon was a man accustomed to absolute control. As a former vice president of operations for a major commercial airline, he had spent his career in climate-controlled boardrooms, ruthlessly cutting maintenance budgets to inflate executive bonuses. He was a master of artificial systems and corporate hierarchy, a man who believed that enough money could buy invulnerability anywhere on Earth. Now stripped of his wealth and his grid, he was just a dying mammal on a concrete floor. Abigail went to work with the cold, clinical precision of an engineer addressing a structural failure. She knew she couldn't warm him too quickly. Throwing him in a hot bath would cause thermal shock and trigger cardiac arrest. She retrieved a pair of heavy trauma shears from her first aid kit and began cutting away his frozen clothing. The expensive layers of Gore-Tex and down had completely failed him once the moisture from his desperate mile-long trek up the ridge had frozen solid. When she pulled his heavy insulated boots off, she hissed through her teeth. His toes were a mottled, horrifying shade of blue-black. The tissue was completely frozen. She stripped him down to his base layers and rolled him into a massive, heavy sleeping bag designed for sub-zero mountaineering. She grabbed several large, flat stones she kept near the rocket mass heater, wrapped them in thick wool towels, and placed them at his core, under his armpits, and near his groin to slowly raise his internal temperature. For 3 hours the wind battered the exposed glass of the Trombe wall. The double-paned argon glass groaned under the pressure, but it held. The black water barrels stood silent and stoic, radiating the stored solar energy of the previous day, fighting back the encroaching chill. The cabin temperature dipped slightly to 62 degrees, but it stabilized. Around 3 a.m., Greg finally stopped his violent spastic shivering. He groaned, his eyelids fluttering open. His gaze darted around the curved earth-walled ceiling, confused and terrified. "Where?" His voice was a dry, broken rasp. "Where is the heat coming from?" Abigail sat in her armchair, nursing a lukewarm cup of tea. She looked at the man who had openly mocked her life's work. "The dirt, Greg, and the sun." Greg tried to push himself up, but a scream tore from his throat. As his body slowly thawed, the agonizing pain of returning circulation hit his extremities. He looked down at his hands. His fingertips were swollen, blistering, and dark purple. "My hands," he gasped, tears springing to his eyes, stripping away decades of corporate arrogance. "God, my hands, and my feet. I can't feel my feet." "You have severe frostbite," Abigail said flatly, her tone devoid of pity but full of factual reality. "You pushed through thigh-high drifts in negative 46-degree weather for a mile. Why did you leave your house?" Greg sagged back into the sleeping bag, sobbing. "The propane. It froze. The generators stopped. The whole house became a freezer in an hour. The glass. So much glass. It just sucked the life out of the room." He looked at Abigail, his eyes wide, with a profound, shattering realization. "I paid $120,000 for that system. It was supposed to be fail-proof." "Nothing is fail-proof if it relies on a fragile supply chain," Abigail replied, nodding toward the massive black barrels lining her southern window. "Physics doesn't care about your bank account, Greg. Propane won't vaporize at negative 44. But thermal mass will always release heat. I didn't build a house to fight the environment. I built one to absorb it." Greg closed his eyes, the physical agony in his limbs mirroring the psychological collapse of his ego. The titan of industry, the man who dictated the fates of thousands of airline employees and ridiculed those beneath his tax bracket, had been reduced to begging for his life at the door of a woman he had called crazy. "I'm going to lose my toes, aren't I?" he whispered into the dark room. Abigail didn't sugarcoat it. "Yes, at least 3 of them. Maybe a finger too. The tissue necrosis is already setting in. But you are breathing. That makes you luckier than anyone else caught outside tonight." The radio crackled to life again. The local emergency band was no longer chaotic. It was eerily, devastatingly quiet. "County dispatch to any listening units. We have total grid failure. The Valley substation has exploded. Repeat, the grid is dead. We have no timeline for restoration. God help us all." Morning broke over the Bitterroot Mountains with a cruel, mocking brightness. The atmospheric collapse had finally exhausted its momentum, leaving behind a sky of piercing cloudless blue that offered light, but absolutely no warmth. The outside temperature hovered at a lethal 35 degrees below zero. Inside the burrow, however, the physics of Abigail Foster's design were executing a flawless, silent resurrection. The moment the sun crested the eastern ridge, its rays struck the massive slanted wall of double-paned argon-filled glass. The sunlight poured through, striking the matte black surface of the 60-50-gallon water drums. The cabin, which had dipped to a chilly but survivable 58 degrees during the darkest, coldest hours of the night, immediately began to warm. The deep earth surrounding the northern walls held firm an impenetrable shield against the lingering razor-sharp wind. Abigail stood by the glass, holding a steaming mug of black coffee, surveying the unrecognizable landscape. The valley below was a frozen alien wasteland. Ancient towering lodgepole pines had been stripped bare, their trunks shattered by the sheer pressure of their internal sap freezing and exploding. A ragged, agonizing groan pulled her attention away from the window. Greg Harmon was awake. He lay on the heavy mountaineering sleeping bag, his skin a ghastly pale gray. He was heavily medicated with the strongest painkillers Abigail had in her trauma kit, but the agony of returning circulation was breaking through the chemical barrier. "My legs!" Greg gasped, his chest heaving as he stared at the curved concrete ceiling. "It feels like someone is driving hot nails into my bones. That's the blood trying to force its way back into necrotic tissue," Abigail said, her voice completely devoid of the deferential tone Greg was used to hearing from women in his corporate life. She walked over and knelt beside him. "Your core temperature has stabilized, Greg, but your extremities are heavily compromised." Greg weakly rolled his head to look at her. The arrogant, untouchable developer who had sneered at her dirt hut was entirely gone. In his place was a terrified, hollowed-out old man. "My house," he whispered. "The generators. I need to call my people. I need to get my maintenance team up here." Abigail sighed, retrieving a heavy brass spotting scope from a nearby shelf. She adjusted the focus and handed it down to him. "Take a look down the ridge, Greg. Look at your fortress." With trembling, blistered hands, Greg lifted the heavy scope to his eye. It took him a moment to find his property in the valley below. When he did, a choked sob escaped his throat. His sprawling, multi-million-dollar architectural marvel was a tomb. Without the massive propane furnaces running to melt the snow and heat the structure, the engineered roof over his grand vaulted living room had failed. A massive section of the expensive timber framing had snapped under the sheer accumulated weight of the snowdrifts, caving directly into the house. The massive bay windows he had bragged about were entirely frosted over the house, completely dead and swallowed by the mountain. $120,000, Greg whispered, dropping the scope onto his chest. Tears leaked from the corners of his eyes, freezing almost instantly on his cheeks. The smart grid, the thermal backups, it's all gone. If I had stayed in that room, I would have been crushed, or I would have just frozen in my sleep. "Systems fail, Greg. Money can't bribe physics," Abigail replied, taking the scope back. "When the grid dies and the fuel lines gel, nature reclaims everything that doesn't adapt to it." Abigail turned away, walking to her communications desk. "I need to get on the radio. Local EMS is paralyzed, but the military might have birds in the air." She powered up her high-frequency ham radio, boosting the signal with the remaining power in her isolated battery bank. She tuned to the regional emergency guard frequency. "Mayday, mayday, mayday. This is civilian station K7 Alpha Foxtrot, relaying critical medical emergency from Pine Ridge coordinates. Over." For 2 agonizing minutes, there was only the hiss of static. Then an exhausted, stressed voice cut through. "Civilian station. This is State Emergency Command. Clear this frequency immediately. We are triaging mass casualties and total grid failure across 4 counties. No civilian rescue units are mobile. Shelter in place. Out. Abigail narrowed her eyes. She grabbed the microphone, her voice dropping into a tone of absolute, unbreakable authority. Command negative. Do not drop this channel. I have a priority 1, trauma. 1 adult male, late-stage hypothermia, severe 4th-degree frostbite on bilateral lower extremities. Risk of systemic sepsis is imminent without immediate surgical intervention. I have a cleared bedrock landing zone at elevation 6,000 feet. You have military assets in the air. I can hear the rotors bouncing off the canyon walls. Route them to me. Now. There was a long pause on the radio. The sheer professional precision of her transmission had clearly caught the dispatcher off guard. A new voice suddenly broke through the static deeper and much closer. K7 Alpha Foxtrot. This is Air Force Rescue, call sign Vanguard 2. We are a Pave Hawk in your sector. We copied your medical assessment. You sound awfully calm for a civilian in the middle of an ice age, over. Vanguard 2. This is Alpha Foxtrot. I'm calm because my house is 68 degrees. Abigail replied sharply. Look for the south-facing ridge above the valley. You'll see a wall of glass and solar panels reflecting the sun. Copy that, Alpha Foxtrot. We have visual on the reflection. Approaching from the south. Keep your head down, we're coming in hot. 10 minutes later, the deafening rhythmic thud of helicopter rotors shook the ground above the cabin. A massive HRWH-60 Pave Hawk, painted in dark, low-visibility grey, crested the ridge. It banked sharply the elite pilots, fighting the treacherous, unpredictable mountain updrafts before hovering directly over Abigail's property. The overwhelming downwash kicked up a blinding, localized blizzard of ice as the helicopter touched down precisely on the wind-scoured granite slab 50 yards from her airlock. 2 men leaped from the open side door. They were Air Force para-rescue jumpers, PJs, the military's most elite extreme medical operators, swaddled in heavy Arctic tactical gear and carrying a rigid Stokes litter. Abigail threw open the heavy steel airlock door, waving them inside. Captain Miller, the lead. PJ rushed through the tunnel, bracing his body for the bitter, lethal cold he expected to find inside the powerless structure. As he stepped into the main living space, he stopped dead in his tracks, nearly causing his medic to crash into him. Miller immediately reached up and ripped off his heavily insulated tactical goggles and neoprene face mask, instantly breaking a sweat. What in God's name? Miller breathed, staring around the bright, heavily lit, earth-walled room. He looked at the digital thermometer on his tactical vest. It is 68 degrees in here. Ma'am, we have flown over 3 towns where people are literally freezing to death in their beds. We lost a guardsman to exposure an hour ago. How are you doing this? Thermal mass, Captain, Abigail said, pointing to the sun hitting the black drums. The earth insulates the water batteries, store the heat. No grid required. My patient is over here. The medic, a broad-shouldered man with the name tape, Harrison, on his chest, dropped to his knees beside Greg. He pulled out a pair of trauma shears and carefully cut away the loose bandages Abigail had applied. Harrison hissed through his teeth, his professional demeanor slipping for a fraction of a second. Jesus! Greg's feet were horrifying. The tissue past the mid-instep was completely black, hard as wood, and dead. Vascular compromise is total past the metatarsals, Harrison reported grimly to Miller, opening his aid bag to prepare IV antibiotics. He's going to lose the toes, maybe the entire front half of both feet. If he had been in the cold for another 40 minutes, he'd be dead. Harrison looked up at Abigail with profound respect. Your slow-thawing protocol saved his vital organs, ma'am. Textbook execution. Miller looked from the broken millionaire weeping on the floor to the calm, composed former structural engineer standing by her clay stove. The strict hierarchy of the outside world had been entirely obliterated. In this frozen apocalypse, the woman who had buried herself in the dirt was a queen, and the corporate titan was a beggar. They loaded Greg into the rigid litter. As Harrison strapped his chest in, Greg reached out with his heavily bandaged, swollen hand and weakly grabbed Abigail's wrist. "Abigail!" Greg croaked his voice, thick with physical agony and a terrifying, permanent humility. He looked her directly in the eyes. "You were right. You were right about all of it. I'm sorry." Abigail gently removed his hand, her expression softening just a fraction. "Just survive the flight, Greg." Captain Miller and Specialist Harrison hoisted the heavy litter. As they prepared to carry the former airline executive out into the howling sub-zero wasteland to the waiting helicopter, Miller paused at the airlock threshold. He looked back at the small, unassuming, dirt-walled cabin that had effortlessly defeated a catastrophic atmospheric anomaly. "Ma'am," Captain Miller said, tapping his helmet in a crisp military salute, an undeniable gesture of profound professional reverence. "This is the most incredible piece of structural engineering I've seen in my entire career. You hold the fort." "Always," Abigail replied. She closed the heavy steel door, threw the deadbolts, and walked back into the quiet, steadfast warmth of the burrow. Outside, the world was broken and frozen, utterly reliant on fragile grids, failing supply lines, and the desperate heroism of rescue crews. But inside the Earth, Abigail Foster sat down in her armchair, picked up her book, and watched the winter sun continue to breathe life into her home. Did you expect this arrogant millionaire to face such brutal consequences for underestimating the power of nature? And brilliant engineering, Abigail's story proves that true survival isn't about buying the most expensive gear. It's about working with the Earth instead of against it. If you loved this intense tale of survival, hard karma, and ultimate vindication, smash that like button, share this story with your friends, and subscribe to our channel for more incredible real-life storytelling. Drop a comment below. Would you survive in the burrow?